Microsoft has become almost synonymous with computers as they gave rise to the personal home computer that we all use today. No matter how much you prefer Mac to Windows, you have definitely come across Windows one time or another, whether at work, school, or while visiting your grandmother's house. But what if Bill Gates was a good boy and never dropped out of Harvard? What if he never founded Microsoft? What if Microsoft never existed? What type of world would we be living in today? The first thing that comes to mind when one thinks of Microsoft is Windows, so let's take a closer look at how a reality without Windows may have turned out. There are three major ways that this modification could have changed the course of history, the first of which being IBM released computing platform. Microsoft actually entered the operating system space when they began developing an operating system for IBM to use in the summer of 1980. IBM had just recently failed to close a deal with Digital Research to license the then popular operating system CP/M. This is why they turned to Microsoft for an OS. Microsoft, seeing the potential in licensing out the OS, made sure to keep the rights in licensing MS-DOS. IBM, who didn't expect other companies to follow along and make computers on a competing level with IBM, didn't mind Microsoft owning the rights to MS-DOS. And this is what eventually gave birth to Windows. But what if Microsoft was non-existent in this scenario? Well, IBM may have not outsourced the creation of an OS at all and taken matters into their own hands. Or they may have returned to Digital Research and renegotiated a deal with them, or they may have outsourced the OS to another tech company. In any of these outcomes, it is likely that IBM would have ended up with the rights to the operating system running on their computers. Considering this, they probably would have started licensing their IBM OS to computer companies that mainly focus on hardware like Dell. It's unlikely that they would have kept the operating system to themselves, as they originally wanted licensing rights to CP/M. If everything else unfolded the same way, this would result in a future that would be most like what we are living in today. IBM was already a computer giant at the time, and they would have simply maintained their lead in the market and grown into the Microsoft that we know today. Moving into the second possibility, we may have seen a world ruled by Linux. If IBM were to simply give up on their push to own the rights to an OS, we may have seen several years with Apple and IBM dominating the computer realm with no chance for a competitor unless they were to develop their own OS. Well, at least up until 1991 when Linux would be released. Linux is an open source operating system that is free to use. It's basically the Android of computers. And even to this day, many people prefer Linux by far over Windows. Linux enthusiasts claim that the only reason that Linux is not more popular than Windows is because Windows already had a good grasp on the market when Linux came out, and people simply didn't want to change. Not to mention the hassle of installing Linux on your own and the fact that Windows is better supported by third-party software. In our alternate timeline, however, the rise of computer giants like Dell and HP may have stalled a couple of years until Linux really caught on, and we may have seen Linux come pre-installed in the machines similar to Android smartphones. With a lot more people using Linux, Linux would have received a lot more attention and developed a lot faster as well. Linux would have a pretty good chance in developing into a popular operating system, but would it have turned out as big as Windows? Probably not. If you take a look at the smartphone market, in the US, Apple controls about a third of the smartphone market. This is despite several competent Android alternatives coming in at a fraction of the price like the Google Pixel 3a. This is because iPhones are seen as the devices with better hardware and software integration, the easiest phones to use, and overall the better product that comes with a hefty price tag, which is somewhat justified. But in the PC market, Mac only controls about 5% of the market share, despite this exactly being how Macs were viewed at the time and are still seen today. So, if Macs had several more years to catch on before a strong competitor like Linux were to come out, we may see Macs being a lot more popular today. Macs would have strong support from third-party developers like Adobe, and we may have never seen Apple enter the downward depths that they reached in the late 1990s and early 2000s. As a result, we may have never seen Apple enter the smartphone market. We may be living in a world where Macs are a lot more prominent and iPhones aren't even a thing. And amongst all of this, Linux would be fulfilling a role similar to Android in the PC space. And then, moving into the third possibility, we may have seen a game of survival of the fittest with every computer manufacturer creating their own operating system to go along with their computer, just like Apple. This is actually not as unlikely as it may seem, as only a handful of manufacturers dominate the computer space today anyways, which are HP, Dell, Lenovo, Asus, and Acer. First of all, in the US, we probably wouldn't have really seen the rise of Asus, Acer, or Lenovo, as they were all Asian companies. These companies have really been able to penetrate the US market because they offer the same Windows experience but for offering a cheaper price than American competitors. But if everyone was forced to make their own operating systems, these Asian companies really wouldn't have picked up much traction in the US, as consumers really wouldn't want to change from what they're used to. You can say that Huawei hasn't caught on as they're banned from the US, but that doesn't explain why other Asian companies like Xiaomi, Vivo, and Oppo haven't caught on. Similarly, in our alternate timeline, Lenovo, Asus, Acer, and Toshiba really wouldn't have a chance against the American giants in the US and Western markets. It would really be between HP and Dell on who was able to win over the consumer PC market. Dell is much more focused on the hardware side and didn't have nearly as much resources as HP was already a huge company while Dell was just a dorm room startup. So, the more likely turnout is HP developing their own operating system. In such a scenario, we would have seen HP dominate the consumer side while Apple would dominate the professional or more heavy user side. And as for Dell, maybe Dell would have started focusing on servers from the very beginning. And in Asian countries, we would see companies dominating that the Western world has never heard about, similar to Tencent or Baidu. Now, that is really weird and it's not nearly as likely as IBM fulfilling Microsoft's role or Linux becoming the Android of the PC space. But those are all just possibilities if Microsoft didn't exist and hadn't created Windows. What about all of their other contributions like Microsoft Office and of course, the Xbox? Microsoft Office is a revolutionary creation that has transformed the workflow of millions of people. Imagine having to manage finances without Excel or making a presentation without PowerPoint. Today, there are so many alternatives, with the most notable one coming from Google with Google Docs, Slides, and Sheets. There are many advantages to those, like being free to use and much more convenient as you could use it on any device. However, Microsoft Office is still the go-to place for professionals, and I think that we'd all agree that it is superior to Google's offerings in terms of user experience, which we would expect as Microsoft Office is quite expensive. This is a realm that I doubt IBM or any other computer manufacturers would have entered. Even Apple hasn't dabbled in this space. But there is one likely candidate to come out with such an array of software, which is Adobe. They've created everything from Photoshop and Premiere Pro to one of the most commonly used file formats for viewing and printing documents, PDF. Adobe would have been the clear candidate to develop something similar to Microsoft Office. There was of course other giant software companies that were created around the same time, like Autodesk, who are the people behind Mudbox and Inventor. But those companies really strayed away from the consumer side as they are really focused on engineering and 3D modeling. So I think that it would be a lot more likely that we're using Adobe PowerPoint rather than a counterpart from someone else like Autodesk. And what about one of the most popular gaming systems, the Xbox? Well, if Microsoft wasn't there to release the Xbox, Sony would definitely have filled their space. Their successful PlayStation series would be even more successful. The PS2 may have reached 200 million sales, and today the PS4 would be bigger than ever before. Or maybe, we would have seen another tech giant release an Xbox equivalent around the same time. This may have come from someone like Nvidia. Or maybe, gaming giant Sega would have never been forced to leave the hardware side of gaming. Of course, they had a slew of other internal issues, but without the Xbox, they would have had a higher chance of survival. Windows, Microsoft, and the Xbox are by far the biggest contributions from Microsoft, but there are so many other huge contributions that have since died out, like Internet Explorer. One of the main reasons Internet Explorer gained a lot of popularity was because it came bundled with Windows. The launch of Internet Explorer basically marked the death of Netscape, which is the popular browser before Internet Explorer. But without Internet Explorer, Netscape would have never lost popularity, and if AOL bought Netscape like they did in our present timeline, Netscape would have been a lot more than $4.2 billion, which is what AOL paid for it, especially with the dot-com bubble. If AOL were to still acquire Netscape, we may have never seen the rise of Google, at least not in the way that we know them today. AOL would have controlled everything on the internet, from the browser to the search engine to email. AOL was the Google of the late 1990s, and if Netscape never died without the rise of Internet Explorer, AOL may have very well retained that position even to this day. Maybe AOL would be the one to buy YouTube and start developing self-driving cars. Who knows, the possibilities are truly endless. And what about Expedia? Expedia was actually a project that was started by Microsoft, and since then, Expedia has grown to a $20 billion company itself. On top of all of this, Microsoft has more than a handful of other launches like the Microsoft Surface, Windows Phone, Cortana, MSN Messenger, Hotmail, Bing, and of course other flops as well like the Zune. In the end, Microsoft truly created the computer experience that we are all used to today, from Windows to Microsoft Office, and since then they have branched into everything from gaming consoles to travel websites. Without Microsoft, we may be looking at a world where HP and Apple dominate the PC space, with AOL still controlling the internet. Google may have never gotten so big, the iPhone may have never been released, and Sony might be bigger than ever before. Clearly, Microsoft is a company that has affected all of us in one way or another, and a world without Microsoft would be vastly different than what we live in today. But that's just one way that it could have turned out if Microsoft was never invented. Make sure to comment down below what you think would have happened. Also, if you guys like this video, make sure to drop a like and consider subscribing if you'd like to see more videos just like this one. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.